This is TWiT.
All right. You said you have done some research. You said.
Listen, it's, and it's not like I set out to cause trouble.
No, it just comes to you.
It just happens.
So I remember I mentioned last week that my son, Lisa's son, who likes drinking Coke with his mixed drinks, had found the Clonakilty and was drinking Clonakilty and Coke. So I said, why don't you just use that Malibu rum? I think you'd like it better, frankly.
Yeah, exactly. The
nice
Captain
whiskey.
Morgan, maybe.
Yeah. I actually went through the cabinet trying to find a whiskey, but there was like Angel's Envy and Lagavulin. There wasn't anything that I wanted to mix with Coke.
You got to keep a bottle of Red Label or Jack around.
Yeah, that's what I was looking for.
Jack and Coke is legit, man. That is a nice drink. It's just like a Crown and Ginger.
It's also good for babies. Just kind of put it up around their gums if they're teething. It's fine.
Yeah. And two fingertips. Bye-bye.
But you have found something really unusual that might actually go very well with Coca-Cola.
Well, yeah, maybe. I don't. This is probably a mixed drink whiskey. So I found this in the shop, and it made me sad. So I bought it. Because as soon as they put the word smooth on a whiskey, you should be concerned.
Well, to combine Caribbean and smooth. This is
the thing. What is
Caribbean smooth Scotch whiskey?
Rum, so the rum,
it's a rum finish, right?
That's but what does that mean? What you have to explain what that means?
Well, and now you get into why the story got a hand, because I've talked about Dewar's before, but I didn't really tell the story of Dewar's. And it is a blended whiskey, and blended whiskeys have what's called marrying casks. So let's start at the beginning. So this is from Dewar's, and John Dewar is one of the most famous blenders of the industry ever. Born in 1805 to a poor family, he falls in with a wine and spirit merchant by 1828 as a 20-year-old from a family relation, guy named Alex McDonald. So they're selling wine and spirits. And he's so successful at it, within a few years, he becomes a partner. They renamed the company McDonald and Dewar. And then he, 9 years after that, in his 40s, he breaks up the partnership to form John Dewar and Sons in Perth, Scotland, specifically focused on whiskey blending. He had a knack for combining whiskeys together. And I got to remember, this is the mid 1800s. Single malts are not really a thing. Certainly, they're not sold specifically, and people don't tend to age for a long time. Barrels are more for storage than for aging. Like, that sort of pattern hasn't happened. And so the whiskeys that are coming out of the barrels are quite harsh. And so whiskey blending was a way to try to take the edge off. But more importantly, the coffee still had happened over in Aeneas Coffee over in Ireland had made this column continuous still that meant distilling grains became cheap. And those grain distillates were a lot lighter. They weren't as harsh as the barley-based barreled malt whiskeys. And so blending, which was the most popular form of making whiskey then, and by the way, is now today too, that's still 90% of the market, was a combination of both grain and single malt whiskeys. And this is what John Dewar figured out. And so made a better tasting whiskey by blending it. He called it Dewar and Sons because he had two sons, John Alexander and Thomas, who were at times literally kids behind the counter at his blending shop back in the day. Now, the whiskey industry changes in 1860 with the Gladstone Spirit Act, because the main thing it did with blended whiskeys is it allowed them to be stored under bond. So what the heck am I talking about? Back in those days, if you were going to blend whiskeys, you had to buy the barrels. And when you bought the barrels, you had to pay the tax on them. And so what you now had was expensive inventory because you'd already coughed a bunch of money. You haven't sold it yet. But with the Gladstone Act, you are now allowed as a blender to have a bond house. So in behind your retail outlet, you have a warehouse with specific rules around it. And only when you take the barrels out of there to sell them do you now have to pay the tax on it. And that sort of breaks open the business. And business kinds of takes off for whiskey then. Whiskey was doing all right locally, but wasn't particularly popular in the rest of the world until 1870. Because in 1870, there was a phylloxera infestation in France. So this is a microscopic sized aphid that was common to American wine grapes. And some clippings had come from America back to the UK. This is the Victorian era. They were big on this. Unaware that this aphid existed, it infected the wine grapes in the UK and then made its way to continental Europe. And so between 1870 and 1880, wine is essentially wiped out in France. And that also includes cognac, which was the popular spirit at the time. Wine and brandy and cognac were the big sellers. It's what the fancy drink was. And suddenly it becomes rare. Now, it's not like these stuff is stored in barrels for a long time as well. So it doesn't disappear overnight. But as the wine production disappears, which means the brandy production is disappearing, those barrels become more and more precious and the price goes through the roof. And so whiskey popularity takes off hugely in the 1870s. By 1880, John Dewar Sr.'s passed away. His sons take over, and it turns out they're a dynamic duo. So John Alexander is the meticulous one. He has the education. He's running the facility. He's all about the blending and actually starts to get into making their own whiskey. So he hires a master distiller and so forth. But Tommy is the marketer. And so he tries to make it. His first gig leaving Perth is to go down to London to try and make some deals. Both those deals go completely sideways, but he doesn't give up. He stays down there. And he gets into a pattern where he starts going around bars in London asking for Dewar's. And if they don't have it, he sends a salesperson there a couple of days later to get something sold. So he starts pumping up the sales and starts to travel, connecting with different people in different parts of the world, to the point where in 1891, Andrew Carnegie, yes, that Carnegie, who knew Tommy, sends him a letter, and they have a copy of this letter, where he recommends sending a cask of Dewar's to the recently elected Benjamin Harrison, President of the United States, which Tommy does to much fanfare and creates a huge stink in America about it, because why is he drinking Scottish whiskey instead of good American whiskey? But, all press is good press, and Dewar's takes off in America. Tommy figures out that this travel thing is good. I mean, this is literally the guy they came up with the term bon vivant from. He then goes on the road for 2 years, traveling country to country. He'll actually write a book called A Ramble Around the Globe about it, experiencing whiskey in different places and promoting Dewar's. He comes up one of the first highballs for whiskey. The whiskey highball is what he calls it, which is just whiskey and soda. Not a big deal. Meantime, back in Scotland, John Alexander, the more serious one, has now gotten the very first royal warrant to supply blended whiskey to Queen Victoria, which they've maintained to this day. And by 1896, he's built a distillery called the Aberfeldy Distillery, which still exists to this day. One of the reasons they built the distillery is that Dewar's is growing so rapidly that they can't buy enough barrels from other distillers to maintain production. So they need to start making their own to some degree. And Aberfeldy's its own legit distillery with its own brands unto itself, but off the thing goes. And of course, John Alexander being contemporary in the late 1800s, the location for the distillery is based on an excellent water source, the Pilty Burn, and it's right on the train line. So that barley is coming up from the lowlands, being made into whiskey in the highlands, and then being transported back down again. Meantime, Tommy makes friends with Thomas Edison and makes the very first promotional film for whiskey in 1899 called It's Scotch. This is also when White Label is released, which is to this day still Dewar's bestseller, the least expensive one. And in 1899, with that new edition, they sell 1 million gallons of whiskey.
Whoa, that's also a lot in those days.
Yeah. And they're also spending 20% of their profits on advertising, which was unheard of. It was almost considered insane to do so. They make a lot of swag. You can find in the museums and things like Dewar's ashtrays and calendars and flatware, like all kinds of nutty things. Of course, now it's the 20th century, so the wars start up. And in World War I, as things get a little crazy, Dewar's merges with one of the other large whiskey blenders, James Buchanan. So there was 3 big blenders at the time: Dewar's, Buchanan, which is the guys who make black and white, and Johnny Walker. So now Buchanan and Dewar's merge together. Of course, they're shut down during World War I, and then as they just get restarted in 1919, then U.S. prohibition, and of course, Dewar's was huge in the U.S., so they take a big hit. but they're well funded. And the combination of Buchanan and Dewar's means as other distilleries get into trouble, they start buying them up. They buy Ord, Pulteney, Parkmore, the Altmore distillery. And then as things get worse, because it's the middle of Prohibition, they ultimately merge with Johnnie Walker and Sons as well. So all three of the big blenders are together, and they merge into what becomes the Distillers Company, DCL. So they're all under one roof. John, they don't get to see the post-Prohibition because John Alexander dies in 29, Tommy in 1930. But their nephew, John Arthur Dewar, takes over. And in 1933, when Prohibition ends, the U.S. sales agent for Dewar is one Joseph P. Kennedy. Yes, that Kennedy. Who
JFK's father, right?
That's right. Who, knowing that Prohibition was about to end, had positioned a shipload of Dewars off the coast of the U.S. so that hours after
OMG
the law passes, the ship arrives and they have Dewars on land.
They used to call him Blackjack, right? Blackjack Kennedy. Yeah.
6 years of booming sales until 1939 with the beginning of World War II, which shuts everything down again. After the war, they come roaring back into the 50s. By 1962, they have these numbers. Dewar's are selling almost 7% of all the whiskey in the world, 2.5 million gallons a year. Their number one customer is the US. The UK is number 2. Of course, whiskey goes through a massive modernization in the 1970s. That's when they stop using malting floors and they switch over to steam and all those sorts of things to increase operational size. By 1980, Dewar's is the number one selling whiskey in America, Scottish whiskey, of course, and they're at 4 million per year. In 86, DCL and Guinness merged together to become the United Distillers Group. And then I found this story that in 1987, a ship archaeologist found the shipwreck of the SS Regina. It sank in Lake Huron in 1913. There were cases of Dewar's on board intact. And then, of course, we've told the story before. United Distillers merges with Grand Metropolitan in 97 to become Diageo. And the UK regulatory group is uncomfortable with how much of whiskey is owned by Diageo. And so Diageo makes a deal and spins off Dewar's to Bacardi, along with Aberfeldy, the related distillery, Altmore, Craigellachie, and Royal Blackla, and Bacardi already owned Macduff. So Bacardi now had a decent portfolio of whiskey independent of Diageo to comply with regulatory needs to diversify just a little bit. So that brings us more or less to today. And there's no point in talking about the distillery because Dewar's doesn't have a distillery. That's Aberfeldy. It's talk about blending because you go looking around for things about blending. It's not that big. They always show like a picture of a guy with a lab coat and a couple of bottles. And it's like, listen, they make a lot more blended whiskey than that. How do they do this at scale? So let's go through what blending actually is. And normally blending, even going back to the early 1800s when this really kicked off, is the combination of both single malt and what's called single grain. The single in this case means single distillery, not one type of grain. Now, of course, in single malt whiskey, because of the Scottish rules, that is only barley, yeast, and water. That's the rules, and distilled with pot stills from a single distillery. Single grain whiskey is made from any combination of grains. So it may be malted barley or not. It could be rye, could be corn, could be wheat, could be any combination thereof. And recognizing that Scottish whiskey rules are so strict that it has to be barley, water, yeast in a pot still. If you do malted barley, water, yeast in a column still, you still have to call it single grain whiskey. All right? Only single malt it's done with a pot still. And there's normally barley in every kind of blend. It's not just single malts. There's usually some in the single grain too. It's inevitable. But the main thing is that typically they use column stills because they're cheap. They make a lot of alcohol quickly. You only have to distill once. You can get up to 90% right away. It runs continuously. You don't have to clean the pot still and rerun it. Like, it's a very rapid process. Depending on the blend, you'll often have just pure grain alcohol, just cut with water, combined with malted whiskey. That's it. More fancier versions, let's take that grain alcohol and age it in barrels as well. It depends. It's not required. But how do they actually make a blend? How did they come to this product? Like, how do we get to Caribbean Smooth here? So this is when we get into the master blender rather than the master distiller. And the master blenders are constantly evaluating barrels of whiskey. Mostly they smell them because you can't taste that many. I was reading one master blender's notes where he said, on average, I will smell 200 different whiskeys in a day and taste 5. So it's mostly about the nose. And they're looking to categorize these different barrels, right? And they have access to a lot of different kinds of whiskey. So one of the reasons that Dewar's got into blending whiskey when he did, having been in the business for a decade already, he had good relationships with a lot of distilleries. And so he's able to get access to those barrels. So the main categorizations for the various flavor profiles are what they call core malts, or defining the overall character of the blend. Then there are flavoring malts, or what they call top dressings, which have special aromatic properties, a particular scent they want, a particular taste they want. Those would be the flavoring malts. And then there's the third category known as packers, or the fillers that really make up about half. And that's just the malts. Then on the grain whiskeys, these are typically distilled high and in the 80-90% range, which is normal for a column still. And then they cut them down to water, with water down to 40% or so, typically to use, again, also as a filler, although they tend to have some of their own flavor as well. But if you're going to make this stuff at scale, you have to have some organization. So the blenders go through the barrel houses and they mark up the barrels, typically with chalk, as to how they're going to categorize them in a core, with a flavor or packer. And then when it's time to make a batch, they send barrelmen in to retrieve the barrels into the blending facility. Okay. And remember that every barrel is different effectively. Even if they've come to common flavor profiles, the actual ABV, the amount of liquid in each of the barrels, it's going to vary. And so they are bringing together hundreds, potentially even thousands of barrels at a time to put into vats. So these barrels are dumped. They pull the bungs from them. They roll them onto a dumper, which is basically a channel, allows the whiskey to flow out of it. It's filtered for debris, and then flows into these blending vats. And these blending vats get big. A small one's a couple of thousand liters. A big one's 200,000 liters, which is 53,000 gallons in the measures of the oppressors. But remember the scale here. At 200,000 liters, you're talking about 260,000 bottles at a batch. So this is a big scale that we're dealing with here. So often, because you don't know what the variations on the barrels are going to be, they actually do this by weight. So they'll pull a core malt group, so 100 barrels at a time, so maybe 20,000 liters, and they'll all be dumped and put into the vat, and they're looking at the weight to know that they've reached the appropriate number of barrels when they stop. And then they'll go and pull some flavoring malts, and then the packers. Another interesting effect that happens is you're filling these things, and sometimes these vats fill from the bottom, sometimes they fill from the top. The volume changes with temperature and humidity, but the mass does not. So they actually have a scale built into these gigantic vats, so they know by the weight how full they are. But the whiskeys tend not to mix; they'll layer up because they're slightly different from each other. They have different densities, and so many of these vats have mixing systems. There might be paddles off the side that move back and forth. There might be impellers, little screws that push the liquid around. Air bubbling's done as well, where they literally putting holes in the bottom that blow air through the system, all to try and mix them. And they're using a lot of different whiskey. Up to 20 different single malts might go into a given blend, and as many as 5 different types of grain whiskey in different combinations. Because grain whiskey is so much cheaper, and you notice that blends cost less, that depending on the whiskey, you can have as much as 80% grain whiskey to 20% malt. But these days, that's been flipped in some respects. High-end blended whiskeys can be as much 70% malt, 30% grain. The challenge here is making the same whiskey year over year. The point that you're making a blend is because you found a flavor profile that people like, and you want to keep selling it. And you're using all these different barrels from all these different distilleries. Sometimes those whiskeys are going to go away. They don't have any more of the 12-year left, and they only have some 10s. So you have to get back to the same flavor profile with each edition. It's very challenging. And you got to admit, these blenders are incredibly talented. Like, their noses are astonishing to be able to find all the pieces of what's going to make their blended whiskey to actually compile them together. After the whiskey is put together in the vat, it'll often stay in that vat for a couple of weeks to sort of, it's part of what they call the marrying process, Just sort of let them sit for a while together before going into marrying casks. So now that you've got it mixed together in a vat, put it back into barrels to marry. Traditionally, these casks are older casks they consider inactive, as they've been used enough for aging. There's not a lot of flavor coming from it now. But in contemporary times, they're doing more what they call active barrelings. The finishing period or the marrying period is as little as 3 months, as much as 2 or 3 years. What really happens is that they sample from these barrels to see how they're evolving. And if they're not evolving anymore, no point in leaving it sit in the barrel any longer. Get it in the bottles where you can sell it. But part of marrying in barrels is the fact that the barrel, even if it's not adding flavor specifically, it does have that pressure, temperature, humidity interaction with the whiskey. So you're breaking this multi-thousand liter vat into 250 liter barrels again, and then letting it sit for a while. And they're all going to go through a little bit of time before you're going to put them back together and bottle them. So, and that also is affected by what was the time of year. If you're only going to do a 3-month age and it's summertime, it's going to have a different behavior than a 3-month in the wintertime. So hence they go a little bit longer, a little bit more complicated, which brings us back to the Dewar's again. So Dewar's has their white label, their original famous. You can buy it almost anywhere. It's about $20 US, easy to come by. There's the 12-year-old for $23, which I mentioned a couple of years ago, July. And then it goes up from there. There's a 15, a 16, and 18. Recently, they started making these things called the double doubles, which the last time I looked was a hamburger, but okay. I think also a kind of, again, you have Dunkin' Donuts too. It's kind of or is that at Tim Hortons, the way they make their coffee. But the double doubles are, again, finishing active barrels. So the double double 21 finished in Oloroso sherry, double double 27 finished in Palo Cortano sherry casks, and the double double 32 in the Pedro Jimenez sherry cask. So they're using active casting for their marrying process. But those are expensive whiskeys. The 21's $60, the 27's $180, the 32's over $500. But those are all older designs. This smooth line, and there's a few of them, started in 2019, starting with this Caribbean smooth. So 6 months of a marry in a rum cask. We don't know which rum casks. And then a couple of years later, they made a Portuguese smooth, so finished in a port cask, a Japanese smooth, so finished in a Minnesota oak cask, that's the Japanese oak, and just recently with the French smooth, which is finished in Calvados cask. So that's apple brandy from France. So here we go. I've already opened this. I've had a few sips of it. I've debated strongly how I really feel about this. It's an 8-year-old, which means the youngest thing in here is 8. And that includes the grain whiskey. The grain whiskey was barreled for 8 years before it was put in. So the nose is pretty harsh, which is funny for a 40%, but it's only an 8-year-old, and there's a lot of grain whiskey in this. Pretty pale color. It's not bad on the mouth. Like, that's kind of nice, but there's really no real sweetness from the rum. And then it finishes poorly. Like this.
That's why you want to put some Coca-Cola in there.
Yeah. After trying this a few times, you can see where the bottle's at. And, a couple of evenings contemplating while writing this. I'm not going to waste whiskey. This thing, you can buy this from a Total Wine or a Bevmo for $25.
What's the point of it?
You know what you can also do? You can buy a Dewar's 12 for $23.
Yeah, I don't get it. What's the point? I
think it's hip to do special finishes in blending these days, active finishes. This is an active finish. Yeah. It's just not a good one.
But it's active.
It's an active,
So is Dewar's, like the 12-year, is that pretty good? The white label?
Dewar's 12 is my go-to.
You're kidding. All right.
When I'm just going to drink a blend, I've already had 2 single malts. And so you're drinking copier fluid, that's a safe bet. I started getting into Dewar's 12 during the pandemic when it was easy to come by, and it's just very drinkable. It's just a nice whiskey, right?
Yeah, I always thought of it as a kind of a decent, everyday kind of.
And there's nothing wrong with white label, but for $3 more, the 12's a big jump, right? And
that's the one to get, huh?
And then the 15's $40. And again, that's not, it's so much more. Like the sweet spot seems to be the 12, and this is $2 more than the 12. Don't do it.
Don't do it. Save yourself.
Save yourself. Drink the 12.
I want to drink rum.
I like rum.
And there are
I like rum. I like
rum.
I like eggs.
There are good rum finish whiskeys, like Balvini's Caribbean Cask.
Oh, interesting.
12.
Balvini makes one. Huh?
Legit, right? And I think I've even mentioned it on the show before, right? Like that's there's nothing wrong with a rum finish. It's cool if it's done well.
Right.
This is not that one. This I think this is hip and stylish, right? The labeling, the word smooth just screams to me, this isn't good. Right?
It's also notably created by their previous master blender, as if it's like the Pat Gelsinger of Dewars.
Well,
like
the 12 is
so unfair.
Oh, that's the 12.
Yeah, the 12 is it's been around a little longer. The new master blender, who's a woman, by the way.
Oh, interesting.
Has done this smooth line, and she had hits with the double doubles. Those are the original smooths, but they're pricey.
Yeah.
Right. And so this was an inexpensive
it's a nice
option.
bottle.
Yeah. It's as soon as you, especially that 32, which is $500.
Yikes.
Right? I think, look, it's a 30-year-old whiskey. That's a bargain for a 30-year-old.
Yeah, I guess, huh?
And so I think she was pushed by production to make an inexpensive version. And that's where you get Caribbean, Portuguese, Japanese, French.
Oh, well, I'm glad you know what? This has been a nice little tour through the backwaters of whiskey making.
I drilled into the whole blending thing because I hate the pictures when you ever talk about blended whiskey of a guy in a lab coat, with two little bottles. It's like
he's like holding it up to the light. Like
you need to make 150,000 of these. Like get to work.
It's really actually impressive what these guys can do.
It's an impressive machine. Yeah. So those little pictures you're seeing is someone who's trying to get to a flavor profile, but then to actually produce it at scale is easy. Huge task, and it's an interesting machine.
It's like when McDonald's makes breakfast that's supposed to be like food. They have like scientists in a lab.
It is
like
in a lab. It's actually just
they're like,
just over the river.
It looks
New
like
Jersey
bacon.
Is the lab.
But what if I had waffles around my sausage and egg?
Yeah. I am thrilled. Yeah, that's a weird.
Yeah, I'm thinking. And let's flapjacks as the bread of the sandwich. What are we thinking?
Yeah. Guess who? Burke found the Thomas Edison. The first commercial for whiskey.
Yeah.
Oh, geez. What?
Scotch. This is from 1898. Let me just
Scotch, but perfected.
It's Scotch. Let's play it for you. I guess there's no sound to it.
No, we're a long way from talkies.
There's a guy jumping around in a kilt.
I assume they hit him with a baseball bat.
There's three guys jumping around.
Enough of this guy.
We've been drinking Scotch.
Pretty sure the guy with the mustache is Tommy Dewar.
Wow. What a character.
He was a character.
Can you imagine being the guy they made up the phrase bon vivant?
Yeah. This is the guy.
I cannot.
He is definitely bon vivant.
I'm mal vivant.
He knows how to do a jig.
Scene vivant.
This is hysterical. So probably Thomas Edison was a buddy.
Yeah.
And said, hey,
there is
Johnny.
A great museum in Perth, the old Dewars, with all of Tommy's. These guys became very famous. They became the sheriff of the town and all these sorts of things. Like they were given titles. There were important people to that part of Scotland. And so, they've built great museums around all this stuff. So all of his letters, a lot of the crazy things that he did, and his book, they're there.
Have you been to the distillery to Aberfeldy?
I have been to Aberfeldy, and it
looks cool.
It's a nice distillery. And they modernized very well. But they've kept some of those common elements. It's not my favorite whiskey in the world. It's nothing. It's a spey. It's nice. Right. Like you can't go too far wrong. There's other things I'll choose from there. Dewars I have a lot of respect for because of their original blends. It's the majority of whiskey. They're super consistent, and there's usually a bottle of Dewars 12 around. But when I saw this thing on the shelf, it's like I got to talk about this. And I got pulled into this whole narrative, right? Which,
it's fascinating.
What happens.
The history of Dewars is very interesting.
Yeah.
And by the way, it wasn't Blackjack. That was his JFK's father-in-law, Blackjack Bouvier. It was just Joe Kennedy.
And just to be clear, when Microsoft said this is for the Dewars, they weren't referring to this Dewars.
It was Dewers.
Yeah, different Dewars.
Different Dewars. Here's to the Dewars.
Yeah, that family.
Thank you so much, Richard Campbell. We love these brown liquor picks of the week and a little story on the side. You'll find Richard at runisradio.com, including his Sysadmin Christmas episode with Rick and Joey. That's episode 961.
I love how dubious you are about their names.
With
Rick and Joey, if that is their real names.
Claus and Snow.
Are they in the witness protection program? What's going on here?